The avoidant has mastered the art of refusal. Every request becomes a threat. Every ask feels like pressure. Every expression of need triggers their retreat. They've trained those around them to tiptoe, to minimize expectations, to shrink their desires into something manageable enough that it won't send them running. But this dynamic only deepens the cycle. The more you seek permission, the more they withdraw. The more you wait for their yes, the more power their no accumulates. The shift isn't about demanding or controlling. It's about reclaiming your autonomy by refusing to hand them the keys to your emotional experience. When you stop asking, stop waiting, stop giving them opportunities to deny you, something fundamental transforms. The relationship no longer revolves around their comfort level with closeness. Your life no longer pauses for their readiness. This isn't about punishing them or playing games. It's about understanding that their no only has power when you've positioned yourself to need their yes. The power dynamic of constant permission seeking. Every time a question is posed to the avoidant about plans, commitment, emotional availability, or future intentions, a subtle transaction occurs beneath the surface. The asker positions themselves in a state of waiting, of dependence on the answer, while the avoidant gains the authority to grant or deny. This dynamic, repeated across countless interactions, establishes a hierarchy where one person's needs become requests, subject to approval, and the other person holds veto power over connection itself. The emotional architecture of the relationship begins to tilt, creating an imbalance that feels increasingly suffocating to one party, while offering the other an endless escape route. The avoidant doesn't consciously seek this power, but they learn to wield it with remarkable consistency. Each no reinforces their boundary, yes, but it also reinforces something deeper, the idea that their partner's desires are optional, negotiable, something to be managed rather than honored. The person asking begins to internalize a painful lesson, that wanting anything from the avoidant is inherently risky, that expressing needs leads to rejection, that the safest path is to want less, ask for less, become less demanding. This internalization doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates through small denials, postponements, vague responses, and the emotional withdrawal that follows any request for more presence, more clarity, more commitment. What makes this dynamic so insidious is its disguise as reasonable boundary setting. The avoidant frames their refusals as self-protection, as honoring their own pace, as maintaining their autonomy. And on the surface, these justifications hold weight. Everyone deserves boundaries. Everyone has the right to say no. But when every interaction becomes a potential rejection, when every invitation to closeness is met with resistance, the pattern reveals itself not as healthy boundary maintenance, but as a systematic avoidance of intimacy itself. The partner learns to read the subtle signs of impending withdrawal and begins editing themselves preemptively, cutting off their own desires before they can be denied, silencing their needs before they can be rejected. This self-editing creates a shrinking effect. The relationship contracts around what the avoidant can tolerate, rather than expanding to hold what both people need. The person doing the asking begins to feel smaller, less entitled to their own emotional reality, less deserving of reciprocity. They may start to believe that their needs are excessive, that their desire for connection is too much, that they are fundamentally too needy. This belief becomes a prison, one where the bars are built from internalized rejection and the fear of hearing no one more time. The avoidant, meanwhile, experiences relief each time their boundary is respected, each time their no is accepted without pushback, each time their partner chooses silence over expression. This relief feels like validation, like proof that distance is necessary, that their way of relating is correct. But beneath this relief often lies something more complex. Many avoidants carry a deep ambivalence about their own patterns. Part of them wants connection, craves closeness, longs for the very intimacy they push away. Yet the self-protective mechanisms are so deeply ingrained that they override these desires automatically. When their partner stops asking, stops seeking, stops trying to bridge the gap, the avoidant may initially feel a sense of freedom. The pressure lifts, the anxiety about being engulfed or controlled dissipates. They can breathe again. But this breathing room often comes with an unexpected companion, a quiet, creeping loneliness that emerges when the pursuit finally stops, when the partner withdraws their attention and invests it elsewhere. The power dynamic of permission seeking only survives as long as one person continues to ask and wait for answers. It requires the continued participation of someone who believes that the avoidance yes is necessary for their own movement forward. The moment this belief dissolves, the moment the person stops positioning the avoidant as the gatekeeper of their emotional experience, the entire structure wobbles. Without someone seeking permission, there's no one to grant or deny it to. Without questions being asked, there are no opportunities to refuse. The avoidant finds themselves in unfamiliar territory, where their typical defensive maneuvers have nothing to respond to, where their refusal has no audience, where there are no echoes in empty space. This shift doesn't require anger or resentment. It doesn't demand confrontation or ultimatums. It simply requires a fundamental reorientation of where authority over one's own life resides. When the person stops asking the avoidant if they're ready, if they're comfortable, if they're willing, and instead begins moving according to their own inner compass, the power dynamic loses its fuel. The avoidant may not even notice at first. They may assume their partner is simply giving them space, respecting their boundaries more effectively. But over time, as the requests stop coming, as the invitations cease, as the emotional labor of pursuing connection is withdrawn, something in the relational field changes. The avoidant is no longer in the position of responding to bids for closeness. They're in the position of watching someone live their life without waiting for permission. The weight of their own patterns. The avoidant attachment style doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It develops as a sophisticated defense mechanism, a psychological adaptation to environments where emotional expression was met with dismissal, neglect, or inconsistency. The child who learned that their needs would not be met, that their emotions were burdensome, that self-sufficiency was the only reliable path to safety, carries these lessons into adulthood with remarkable fidelity. The patterns become automatic, operating below conscious awareness, shaping every relationship with the same protective strategies that once ensured survival. But patterns that serve a purpose in childhood often become prisons in adulthood, and nowhere is this more evident than when the avoidant finds themselves alone with the consequences of their own withdrawal. When expectations are removed, when a partner stops asking for what they need, the avoidant loses the familiar structure of response and refusal. This absence creates a psychological vacuum. The avoidant has spent so much energy managing the perceived demands of others, maintaining distance, protecting their autonomy, that they rarely turn their attention inward to examine what they themselves contribute to the relational dynamic. They focus on what others ask of them, how others pressure them, how others threaten their independence. But when those others stop asking, stop pressuring, stop pursuing, the avoidant is left facing something far more uncomfortable, the reflection of their own patterns mirrored back in the silence. This confrontation with their own behavioral architecture often begins subtly. The avoidant might notice that conversations feel different, that their partner seems less invested in their responses, that the emotional temperature of the relationship has cooled not because of conflict, but because of withdrawal. There's no fight to point to, no dramatic moment of rupture, just a gradual realization that the other person has stopped organizing their life around the avoidance availability. This shift can feel disorienting because it removes the external pressure that the avoidant has been defending against. Without someone pushing for more, the avoidance defenses have nothing to push back against. They're left holding their walls up in empty space, protecting themselves from a threat that has quietly walked away. The weight of their patterns becomes visible in this emptiness. The avoidant begins to see, often with great resistance, that their need for distance isn't just a boundary, but a barrier. That their discomfort with closeness isn't just a preference, but a limitation. That their autonomy, so fiercely guarded, has been maintained at the cost of genuine connection. This recognition doesn't arrive as a sudden epiphany. It seeps in slowly, through the accumulation of moments where the avoidant reaches out, however tentatively, and finds that their partner is no longer waiting with open arms. The partner has their own plans now, their own emotional investments, their own life that continues with or without the avoidant's participation. Many avoidants experience this as a form of abandonment, which carries a particular irony. They've spent the relationship creating distance, ensuring escape routes, maintaining emotional separation, and yet, when their partner finally respects that distance fully, it feels like rejection. This paradox reveals the deep ambivalence at the heart of avoidant attachment. The avoidant wants closeness and fears it simultaneously. They want to be pursued, but resent the pressure of pursuit. They want someone to stay, but need the freedom to leave. These contradictory desires create an impossible situation for any partner, but they also create an impossible situation for the avoidant themselves, who can never quite settle into connection or fully embrace solitude without the nagging sense that something essential is missing. The patterns the avoidant has relied upon begin to feel less like protection and more like self-sabotage. The strategies that once kept them safe now keep them isolated. The defenses that prevented hurt now prevent joy. The walls that blocked pain also block intimacy, vulnerability, growth, and the kind of deep knowing that comes only through sustained emotional presence. When a partner stops trying to scale these walls, stops exhausting themselves trying to find the door, the avoidant is left inside the fortress alone, and the architecture that felt like safety begins to feel like confinement. This realization carries weight because it implicates the avoidant's entire relational framework. It's not just about one relationship or one person. It's about a pattern that is repeated across time, across multiple connections, across every intimate bond that has ended in distance or dissolution. The avoidant may begin to notice the common thread in these endings: their own withdrawal, their own unavailability, their own retreat at the moments when connection deepened. This pattern recognition can be devastating because it removes the comfort of external blame. It's harder to tell themselves that others are too demanding when someone stops demanding anything at all. It's harder to claim that others don't respect their boundaries when someone finally honors those boundaries so completely that they stop crossing the threshold entirely. The emotional labor that the avoidant has avoided throughout the relationship suddenly becomes unavoidable. They must sit with their own discomfort, their own fears, their own unmet needs that have been buried beneath layers of self-sufficiency. They must confront the possibility that their independence has been a shield against dependency rather than a genuine expression of autonomy. They must examine whether their need for space has been about honoring themselves or about avoiding the terror of being truly known. These questions don't have easy answers, and the avoidant's typical response to difficulty is to retreat further. But when there's no one left to retreat from, when the partner has already created their own distance, the avoidance options narrow considerably. How expectations become weapons in avoidant relationships. Expectations in relationships serve as the invisible infrastructure of partnership. They communicate what each person needs to feel valued, respected, and loved. They create predictability, reliability, and a sense of mutual investment in the relationship's well-being. For most people, expectations are simply the articulated or unarticulated agreements about how partners will show up for each other. But for the avoidant, expectations transform into something far more threatening. They become pressure, obligation, entrapment. They represent the loss of freedom, the sacrifice of autonomy, the surrender of self to another's needs. This perception turns the ordinary mechanics of partnership into a battlefield where every expectation feels like an attack. The avoidant experiences expectations as demands, even when they're expressed gently, even when they're reasonable, even when they're fundamental to any functional relationship. The expectation of regular communication feels like surveillance. The expectation of quality time feels like consumption of their energy. The expectation of emotional availability feels like an invasion of their inner world. The expectation of commitment feels like a cage closing around their independence. These reactions are not rational assessments of what's being asked. They're triggered responses rooted in deep fears about losing themselves in connection, about being controlled or consumed, about repeating early experiences where their needs were ignored or their autonomy was violated. What makes this dynamic so painful is that the person holding expectations isn't trying to control or trap the avoidant. They're simply asking for the basic elements of partnership: presence, consistency, reciprocity, emotional engagement. But the avoidance nervous system reads these requests as threats, activating defense mechanisms that create distance precisely when closeness is being invited. The partner begins to notice that every time they express a need, the avoidant pulls away. Every time they ask for more, they receive less. Every time they articulate an expectation, they're met with resistance, avoidance, or a subtle withdrawal that communicates their ask was too much. This pattern teaches the partner a brutal lesson that having expectations guarantees disappointment. They learn to lower their standards, to accept breadcrumbs, to celebrate the bare minimum, because anything more feels impossible. They learn to frame their needs as optional, their desires as negotiable, their right to partnership as something to be grateful for, rather than something inherent to the relationship itself. This diminishment of self happens gradually, through 1,000 small moments where they chose silence over expression, where they swallowed their disappointment, where they convinced themselves that asking for less would create more safety for the avoidant to show up. But the terrible irony is that lowering expectations doesn't make the avoidant more available. It simply removes the external structure that might have created accountability. The avoidant doesn't experience fewer expectations as an invitation to give more freely. They experience it as confirmation that distance is acceptable, that their minimal engagement is sufficient, that their partner will adapt to whatever level of involvement they're willing to offer. The relationship contracts around the avoidant's comfort zone, and that zone rarely expands on its own. Without the friction of unmet expectations, without the discomfort of disappointing someone they care about, the avoidant has little motivation to examine their patterns or push against their own limitations. When expectations are removed entirely, when a partner stops asking for anything, the dynamic shifts in a way the avoidant doesn't anticipate. The absence of expectations isn't experienced as freedom, but as irrelevance. The partner who once organized their emotional life around the avoidant's availability now organizes it around their own needs, their own schedule, their own priorities. They stop waiting for the avoidant to be ready for plans and make plans without them. They stop hoping for emotional support and find it elsewhere. They stop expecting consistency and build their own stability independent of the avoidant's presence or absence. This shift doesn't happen out of spite. It happens out of necessity, out of self-preservation, out of the recognition that waiting for the avoidant to meet them halfway means waiting indefinitely. The avoidant often misreads this shift initially. They may feel relief that the pressure is lifted, that they're no longer being asked to show up in ways that feel uncomfortable. They may interpret their partner's new independence as evidence that the relationship is finally working, that boundaries are being respected, that equilibrium has been achieved. But this relief is typically short-lived. As the partner continues investing their energy outside the relationship, as they build a life that doesn't revolve around the avoidant's emotional availability, the avoidant begins to notice something unsettling. They're no longer central to their partner's world. The person who once pursued them, who once cared deeply about their response, who once held space for their presence, has redirected that attention elsewhere. This is when expectations reveal their true function. They weren't weapons at all. They were invitations. They were expressions of desire for the avoidant's presence, evidence that the partner wanted them involved, proof that they mattered. When those expectations disappear, so does the evidence of mattering. The avoidant finds themselves in the strange position of having won the battle for autonomy while losing the war for connection. They have all the space they wanted, all the freedom they craved, all the distance they worked so hard to maintain. And in that space, that freedom, that distance, they discover something they didn't expect: loneliness. Not the comfortable solitude of chosen independence, but the hollow ache of being unneeded, unimportant, peripheral to someone's life who used to hold them at the center. The liberation of self-directed action. The moment a person stops waiting for the avoidant's approval, stops seeking their participation, stops adjusting their life to accommodate the avoidant's comfort level, a profound transformation occurs. This isn't about retaliation or creating distance out of anger. It's about the simple recognition that life continues regardless of whether the avoidant is ready to engage with it. Self-directed action emerges not from a place of giving up on the relationship, but from reclaiming authority over one's own existence. It's the understanding that waiting for someone else to be ready means putting one's own life on hold indefinitely, and that no relationship, no matter how valued, justifies that level of self-abandonment. This liberation begins internally with a subtle but significant shift in perspective. The person stops asking themselves what the avoidant would be comfortable with and starts asking what they themselves need. They stop filtering their desires through the lens of the avoidant's likely response and start honoring those desires as valid regardless of external validation. This internal reorientation doesn't happen overnight. It requires unlearning deeply ingrained patterns of accommodation, challenging the belief that their needs are secondary, and confronting the fear that prioritizing themselves will result in abandonment. But once this shift takes root, it fundamentally alters how they move through the world. Self-directed action manifests in concrete ways. Plans are made without consultation, without waiting to see if the avoidant will be available or willing to participate. Social connections are deepened without concern for whether the avoidant approves or feels threatened by outside relationships. Personal goals are pursued with full investment rather than being kept on the back burner in case the avoidant needs attention. Emotional needs are met through friendships, therapy, creative outlets, and self-reflection rather than being perpetually deferred in hope that the avoidant will eventually show up. Each of these actions represents a radical departure from the previous dynamic where the avoidant's potential response determined what was permissible. The psychological freedom that accompanies self-directed action is immense. There's a lightness that comes from no longer carrying the weight of someone else's emotional unavailability. There's relief in not having to manage another person's discomfort with closeness. There's clarity in recognizing that autonomy doesn't require permission, that living fully doesn't need approval, that joy doesn't depend on someone else's readiness to participate in it. This freedom isn't about disconnection from the avoidant. It's about reconnection with oneself, with the parts that were gradually silenced through repeated accommodation of the avoidant's limitations. For the avoidant, this shift can be profoundly disorienting. They're accustomed to being consulted, to having their availability checked, to being given the option to participate or decline. When their partner stops offering these options, stops including them in the decision-making process, stops waiting for their input, it creates a strange reversal. The avoidant is no longer in the position of setting boundaries around involvement. They're in the position of discovering that their involvement is no longer assumed, no longer central, no longer necessary for their partner's plans to move forward. This reversal often triggers anxiety in the avoidant, the very anxiety they've been defending against through distance and control. The avoidant may attempt to reassert their influence, to reclaim their position as someone whose opinion matters, whose presence is valued, whose participation is desired. They may express interest in activities they previously declined, suggest plans they once avoided, or show concern about decisions being made without their input. But these attempts often come too late, emerging only after their partner has already learned to function independently. The partner, having built their own life and emotional infrastructure, no longer needs the avoidant's sudden interest. They've discovered they can be happy, fulfilled, and purposeful without the avoidance engagement, and this discovery cannot be undone. Self-directed action also reveals to the person how much energy they were spending trying to manage the avoidance emotional state. The constant calculations about whether to ask for something, how to phrase a request to minimize defensiveness, when to express needs without triggering withdrawal, what to suppress to maintain peace. All of this cognitive and emotional labor becomes visible only in its absence. Without these calculations, there's mental space for other things: creativity, ambition, pleasure, spontaneity, genuine connection with people who reciprocate freely. The contrast between the exhaustion of accommodation and the ease of self-direction becomes stark. This liberation also changes how the person experiences disappointment. When they were waiting for the avoidant, every no felt personal, every withdrawal felt like rejection. Every instance of unavailability felt like evidence of their own unworthiness. But when they stop asking, stop waiting, stop expecting, disappointment loses its sting. The avoidance absence becomes neutral information rather than emotional devastation. If the avoidant isn't available, it simply means they're not available. The person makes other plans, invests elsewhere, continues moving forward. The avoidance participation becomes a bonus rather than a necessity, and this shift in framing is psychologically transformative. The avoidant often struggles to understand this transformation. They may interpret their partner's self-direction as coldness, as withdrawal, as punishment for their own unavailability. They may feel hurt that they're no longer being pursued, that their partner has stopped trying to bridge the gap, that the relationship no longer revolves around their comfort level. But what they're experiencing isn't cruelty, it's consequence. It's the natural result of consistently declining invitations, of repeatedly choosing distance over connection, of maintaining walls so high that eventually people stop trying to climb them. The person hasn't stopped caring. They've stopped waiting. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, changes everything. Releasing the need for their participation. The deepest shift occurs not in action, but in attachment to outcome. A person can make their own plans, pursue their own goals, and live independently while still emotionally tethered to the avoidant's approval or involvement. True release happens when the need for the avoidant's participation dissolves entirely, when their presence becomes genuinely optional rather than secretly hoped for. This release isn't about indifference, it's about acceptance. It's the recognition that the avoidant may never be capable of showing up in the ways that feel nurturing, that they may never overcome their discomfort with closeness, that waiting for them to change is a form of self-abandonment disguised as loyalty. Releasing the need for their participation requires grieving. It requires mourning the relationship that could have been, the partner the avoidant might have become if they were willing to do the inner work necessary to move towards secure attachment. It requires acknowledging that potential isn't the same as reality, that good moments don't erase consistent patterns of withdrawal, that love alone cannot bridge the gap created by fundamental incompatibility in relational needs. This grief is real and valid. It honors what was hoped for while accepting what actually is. And in that acceptance, paradoxically, freedom emerges. The person begins to notice that their emotional well-being no longer fluctuates with the avoidant's availability. A text from the avoidant doesn't create a surge of hope. Silence from the avoidant doesn't trigger anxiety. An invitation declined doesn't feel like rejection. The avoidant's presence or absence becomes background information rather than the determining factor in the person's emotional state. This stabilization of mood and self-worth, independent of the avoidant's behavior, represents a return to wholeness, a reclamation of the emotional autonomy that was gradually eroded through the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. Releasing the need for participation also means releasing the fantasy of reciprocity. The person stops imagining scenarios where the avoidant suddenly becomes emotionally available, where they realize what they're losing, where they show up with the consistency and presence that's been missing all along. These fantasies, comforting as they may be, keep the person tethered to a version of the avoidant that doesn't exist. They create false hope that postpones acceptance and prolongs suffering. When these fantasies are released, when the person stops waiting for the avoidant to transform, they can finally see the relationship clearly, as it is, not as they wish it would be. This clarity often brings a sense of peace that was impossible during the cycle of hope and disappointment. There's no longer the whiplash between moments of connection and stretches of distance. There's no longer the confusion about whether the relationship is working or failing. There's simply acceptance that the avoidant operates within certain limitations, and those limitations make genuine partnership impossible. The person can appreciate what the avoidant is capable of offering without resenting what they're not. They can hold affection for the avoidant as a person while recognizing that affection doesn't obligate them to accept inadequate treatment. For the avoidant, this release can be more unsettling than active anger or visible hurt. When their partner was clearly affected by their unavailability, the avoidant could see their impact, could measure their importance through the other person's distress. But when that distress disappears, when their partner achieves equanimity, regardless of the avoidant's choices, the avoidant loses their measure of mattering. They can no longer tell themselves that their partner needs them, that their presence is essential, that their eventual availability will be met with gratitude and relief. The partner has moved beyond needing them, and this realization often triggers the very abandonment fears the avoidant has been defending against all along. The avoidant may escalate attempts at connection precisely when their partner has released the need for it. They may offer more vulnerability, more consistency, more presence than they've shown throughout the relationship. But these offerings often come from a place of fear rather than genuine readiness for intimacy. They're attempts to reclaim the position of importance, to restore the dynamic where they controlled the distance and their partner waited hopefully. The person who has released the need for participation can see through these attempts. They recognize that momentary increases in availability don't constitute lasting change, that fear of loss doesn't equal capacity for sustained connection, that the avoidance discomfort with their independence doesn't create obligation to return to old patterns. This release also protects the person from being manipulated by intermittent reinforcement. The avoidance pattern often includes periods of withdrawal, followed by sudden warmth, creating an addictive cycle where the person never knows which version of the avoidant they'll encounter. This unpredictability keeps them hooked, always hoping the warm version will become permanent, always forgiving the cold version because the warm one exists. But when the need for participation is released, intermittent reinforcement loses its power. The person no longer experiences the warm moments as proof that the relationship can work. They see them as temporary fluctuations in an overall pattern of unavailability. The ultimate release is the release of responsibility for the avoidance emotional growth. Many people in relationships with avoidance take on the burden of helping them heal, of creating enough safety for them to open up, of being patient enough that eventually the walls come down. They believe that if they just love the avoidant correctly, consistently, unconditionally enough, the avoidant will learn to trust and reciprocate. But healing avoidant attachment is internal work that only the avoidant can do. No amount of external love, patience, or accommodation can bypass the avoidant's own resistance to vulnerability. When this truth is accepted, when the person releases the belief that they can fix or save the avoidant, an enormous weight lifts. They're no longer responsible for another adult's emotional development. They're only responsible for their own well-being, their own choices, their own path forward.